Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
Hi, I'm Mark Hoffman, proud member of the Conversations Across Time team and a retired history teacher. Tonight's show, I protect Ulysses S. Grant, President of the United States from 1869 to 1877 during the critical period of Reconstruction. I also was the 8th president of the National Rifle Association. As you will see, that becomes important. Also on the panel this evening are the show's host, attorney Vivian Crawford, and attorney Irv Madnick, who was involved in many cases that involved gun violence. During the show this evening, the panel will discuss the bastardization of the Second Amendment and how the original charter of the National Rifle Association has also been bastardized to make sure that every American thinks that it's all right to own guns. We will discuss how money, lobbying, political action committees, propaganda, and racism influence people's perception of gun ownership and the critical problem of mass shootings in the United States of America. Stay tuned for a very provocative and educational show. The situation is critical. In this country, it is easier to buy an AR-15 assault weapon than this stogie I hold in my hand. Enjoy the show.
A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of the state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. I've just read for you the Second Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. Tonight, my guest, President Ulysses Grant.
Good to be here.
Good to have you here, sir. And my dear friend, Mr. Irv Madnick, retired defense counsel in Philadelphia, well known, and someone who loves having constitutional arguments. So tonight we are beginning a series which we're calling the NRA and the Bastardization of the Second Amendment. We will discuss the implications and impact, and perhaps later on in the series we'll get to the reaction to the court's decision. We will examine the intent of the founders of the Second Amendment, and we will examine the intent of the founders of the NRA. This is part one of a series, and hopefully we will get to discussing the recent tragedies that have happened in this country, the mass shootings and the political response there too. So at this point, I'd like us to begin, if I can, with you, President Grant, to discuss how it was that the NRA came into being and what you felt the response to your experience in the Civil War led you to decide it was necessary.
Yes. The fact of the matter is, I was the 8th president, by the way, of the National Rifle Association. And my fellow General Burnside was one of the founders. And the original charter and the original intent of the organization came to us because the Union soldiers had no conception of how to handle and how to fire and how to maintain firearms. Those Southern boys during the war had us beat 100 to 1, 1,000 to 1. And we felt that if there were another war and we had to have people serve in the military, we would need people that were better prepared to handle weapons. And so General Burnside started the organization It's basically a gun club to teach people the maintenance of the weapons, how to fire the weapons properly, and how to care for the weapons. And basically, that's what our organization was. We were originally chartered, I believe, in New York State, and it was a shooting club to teach people how to handle the weapons in many ways, like the clubs you have now, where people go and target practice and are taught the proper ways to handle weapons. It had nothing to do primarily with the Second Amendment, with the right to bear arms, or anything like that.
It's interesting because Irv, you and I as attorneys always, we recoil somewhat when we hear the interpretations that have been placed on the Second Amendment. And it does make sense, in speaking with the general, it makes sense that Northerners would not have had experience with weapons. I mean, people in the North primarily lived in cities. There were some farm areas, but the need for carrying a weapon that was a Southern tradition.
Well, that's true, except they used the weapons well enough to win the war, so
But that
wasn't that terrible.
No, it wasn't. No, because it was a distinct disadvantage for us at the beginning of the war, especially.
Sure.
And I hate to say it because I was accused of being a butcher, but we had to exploit more manpower per inch of territory we took because we weren't very skilled in handling weapons. And Burnside originally, and I later on, understood this.
And you're being very modest, President Grant, because one of the things that history, I know that there's discussion about that you have been called a butcher, but history has said that you were brilliant, your strategies were brilliant. The capture of Vicksburg, which cut off the Mississippi and cut off the South being able to transport up and down the Mississippi, was certainly a brilliant strategy on your part. So, yeah, you might have been a butcher, but the reality is...
There were a lot of negative things put out there about me. That was one of them, being a butcher, and the other was, of course, my drinking, which was totally false. But thank you for that compliment. I don't consider myself a genius. I was at the bottom 10 of my class at West Point, but thank you.
Well, you got it done.
Well, regardless, and with all kudos to President Grant, the original interpretation of both the founding of the NRA and the original interpretation of the Second Amendment have changed considerably.
Yes.
I feel, for the negative over the course of time. And the real issue here is not whether we taught people how to shoot well after the Civil War, but the real issue here is how can we limit or solve the problems that are created by the current interpretation, the Second Amendment, which was a direct result of a Supreme Court case in 2008 called Heller, which Heller versus the District of Columbia, which was a repudiation of a case in 1939, which interpreted the Second Amendment basically in the way that myself and all of my professors, when I went to law school, had interpreted the Second Amendment to mean. And I think the Second Amendment, it's difficult to read it and come up with a clear definition, because it's subject to interpretation, there's no question about it, but the clear interpretation that we had always lived with, at least until Heller, was that the Second Amendment was designed to create militias for the states, so that the federal government could not overrun the states and exert their will over the states, and it was a matter of states' rights. And this, of course, grew out of the English experience, where the king just came in and wiped everybody away and used force to enforce his rule, and that's what it was.
Why do you think that this, first of all, that the Miller case, and just to give our audience a little background, so the Miller case comes about in the 1930s. During that, it was a public outcry as a result of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre.
Right, it had to do with the criminal element.
They
had guns, and they had what were called the Tommy guns, which are
the Tommy
sort of like assault
guns.
rifles, sort of like assault rifles today. And they killed a lot of people. I mean, most of the people they killed were rather gangsters, but it still gained a lot of notoriety and during that period of time. And the case grew out of that experience after Prohibition and the increase in the criminal element along with Prohibition. But the Miller case interpreted the Constitution in the way that it was originally intended for. And Madison, when he brought the Second Amendment forward, which was directly after the Constitution had been signed by everybody, it was his idea to increase the power of the militias, so to speak. And now today, of course, the National Guard in each of the states is a distinct outgrowth of that thinking back when the Second Amendment was first proposed and initiated.
But it's my understanding that the state militias, and especially in terms of what was going on prior to the ratification of our Constitution, was in a large measure to protect the slave-holding states from slave revolts and slavery insurrections, and that these militias were very important because there was a tremendous amount of unrest among the slaves, and there were slave rebellions in all of the states, and the militia were specifically designed to quell those rebellions. And the fear with the ratification of the Constitution was that a standing national army under the control of a federal government controlled by the North would somehow come down and back to slaves in terms of wanting their freedom, and that came to fruition during my presidency, when after the Civil War and the slaves were freed, there was an attempt during Reconstruction on the part of the Southerners to reenact a form of slavery, and they wanted the militia to protect them against the slaves, and I even had to use federal troops to enforce some of the laws to make sure that the newly freed African Americans were guaranteed the right, especially the right to vote.
And also, let's say later on, I mean, moving that from the south to the north, later on, the National Guard, which was the outgrowth of the militia, was used to quell the labor riots when the labor unions came into play, and in the coal mines in New Jersey and in the steel mills, with the labor movement, they used the National Guard to actually help in preventing those outrisings of violence as a result of that.
A couple of things that you in both of your statements that is interesting, and we need the audience to understand, and that is that you, President Grant, had a terrific civil rights background. I mean, you certainly put the federal troops in the South to make certain that the newly freed slaves would be able to vote. You had a record that was peerless. I think maybe later on Johnson might have tried to come up to your standards, but you certainly did do that.
Not the man before me, Johnson.
I'm sorry, Lyndon Johnson. I'm so sorry. So there's that, and then when we talk about the labor unions, as you just alluded to, her, what we see happening, what we saw happening, is that the Compromise of 1877, in which the federal troops were pulled out of the South, they were dispatched to quell all these labor revolts.
Correct. And that's what later led to the National Guard, during the 30s with the labor movement. So there was history for that, and that was part of the history. And those Southern troops, of course, we talked about the compromise. That was to make those states in the South Democratic states now, and other parts of the Confederacy. So that was all part of that. But and whether it was noble or not noble, and obviously it was noble in some areas, not so noble in other areas. That was an outgrowth of what the Second Amendment was originally meant to mean.
But the same people that today would advocate everyone having the right to own guns, and there were people then that were advocating the right for people that own guns, denied lots of people the right to own guns because of their race or where they were at politically, for example.
Not unlike today.
Yes, and the Black Codes during Reconstruction banned African Americans from owning any type of firearm, even though they were citizens like everyone else. And of course, some of the early attempts to ban weapons were because anarchists had weapons, and especially in the early 1920s, there was great fear of anarchism and communism. So, on the one hand, if you were politically incorrect, people were willing to take your weapon away from you. But if you were politically correct, it was an absolute right. But it's not absolute.
Well, I don't think up until Heller that it was ever determined that the was an absolute right to have a weapon. Even Heller didn't say that, but I remember in my early experience in Philadelphia, for instance, if you wanted to carry a weapon, you couldn't just walk into a gun store, show them your identification, make sure that you didn't have a criminal record, and walk out with a gun. It didn't work that way. You had to give good cause why you needed that weapon, and you had to go through a lot of hoops. You had to prove that you could use it safely, that you really needed it.
Were you required to take had to go to a range and prove that you could shoot the gun?
You could shoot the gun, you knew how to safely handle the gun, and you went through a permit procedure that if you couldn't establish that you absolutely needed it. For instance, a diamond merchant who was walking around Philadelphia, a lot of these guys walk around with $1 million worth of diamonds in a little suitcase. Well, they had a need to do that because there was a chance that they could get robbed, of course. Or somebody who just took the cash from a store that he had and had it deposited in a bank at night. That was cause to be allowed to have a gun. A lot of people had guns in their homes, individual guns, or they had hunting rifles, or they went to clubs to shoot rifles or guns. But there was not this proliferation of guns, and not just this easy way to be able to buy a gun either through a gun store or especially at these gun shows where very little evidence is needed to be able to purchase a gun. It's just incredible. And of course, it's led to the situation today where kids, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, are walking around with weapons and killing each other. And the sale of assault weapons, which is not regulated at all, where people can fire off hundreds of rounds in a second or two and kill multiple people in no time, it's insane. And that's what this is all led to.
And that's
all a direct. It's not only Heller confirmed that.
Yes.
But it was actually moving in that direction before Heller. I mean, I think you can date back to the late 60s or early 70s, where the NRA really developed. I think it was in 1976 that they developed the
Institute for Legislative,
which was their lobbying.
Which is their lobbying. Their lobbying.
And they have been able to usurp the original intention of what the Second Amendment meant to what they believe it should mean, and that is that everybody should be able to carry a gun, walk around with a gun, carry an assault rifle on their shoulder if they want to, open carrying and weapons like many states.
But when you say usurp the Second Amendment, they've also usurped the original intent of the NRA. That's
absolutely
no question about it.
It was
a noble organization.
It was a noble organization that was geared to gun safety,
yes,
and gun efficiency in terms of marksmanship, and we didn't even consider handguns. That wasn't even something that we even talked about. That's why the name of the organization was the National Rifle Association.
I didn't realize that.
We didn't even talk about handguns. The handguns were not even in our charter. It was about rifles, how to handle rifles. We engaged in shooting contests with other for sport,
sure.
And we didn't even conceive of assault weapons or sidearms, which is what we call them during the Civil War, sidearms. And so our organization has been changed dramatically. In fact, early on, we supported gun control.
Absolutely. The Gun Control Act of 1934 was supported by the NRA. Even the Gun Control Act of 1968 was supported by the NRA. That's before the founding of the Institute for Legislative Adjustment.
the lobbying arm.
It's the lobbying arm of the NRA, ILA, and that's it just changed in the 70s. And that's an interesting note, that the National Rifle Association was about rifles and about using the proper use of weapons.
Right. Now, I
mean,
think
if we wanted to call it for what it is today, we would have named it the National Firearms Association or the National Gun Ownership Association. We were specific, and it evolved out of the fact that our boys that we drafted it towards the end of the war had no conception of how to use a weapon. And I wish we had automatic weapons during the Civil War. Of course, we got them at the very end, and it was one of the advantages we had. But
well, you're a military guy. You wish you had the atomic bomb.
Of course, but the point being that no one was talking about owning sidearms until the manufacturers influenced our organization in the 70s and became instrumental in influencing the legislative branch to pass laws that guarantee gun ownership, and then these laws will be challenged in court. And because of the undue influence of money in our political system, and of course that happened when I was president as well,
sure,
the courts started to rule in favor and a much more favorable interpretation in terms of everyone being able to own a sidearm or a handgun or an assault weapon.
Well, the question though is why? Why did this movement take shape in the early 70s and of course culminated with the ILA? Why did it happen? And what led up to it? And what's the genesis of this, and why did it become so powerful? And this is only an opinion on my part, but I think that the tumultuous times that we had in the 60s after the assassination of Kennedy and the assassination of Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, and the riots, the race riots in the major cities in this country, in almost every major city, Philadelphia, Newark, Chicago, St. Louis, Washington, D.C. I think there was a tremendous fear amongst a lot of people in this country, not necessarily the people who lived in these urban areas so much because they understood what the situation was, but the people who lived in the outlying areas, in the suburbs, and in the communities in the South and the rural communities around the country, felt tremendously intimidated by this and felt that it was something. And the Black Panthers, by the way, they got all of that publicity and so forth. They were definitely afraid of what could happen if there was organization amongst the black people in this country, and they were protecting themselves. I think, and that's truly what I believe started this. And when you look at the ownership and the membership of the NRA today, and where the money comes from, I think you'll find that it comes from mostly an alt-right, white population.
It's interesting because Madison, in his the thought was to make certain that the slaves did not get their hands on weaponry, that the North did not come down and take over and do away with slavery. So we're back to the same issue.
Right, and the issue was
the same issue.
Right, it's the same issue, and the issue. You know, then the next question is, well, you know, how can we solve this problem? And we'll probably talk for a couple hours on that. I don't think anybody knows how to necessarily solve it.
Mr. Crawford gave me a compliment about my resume on civil rights, but I would say categorically that you cannot understand gun control in this country and the gun issue in this country without understanding the racial implications and racism in this country.
We never talk about it.
Well, we do talk about it a lot. We do, but not enough.
But
again,
that when the Black Panthers in the 60s had weapons, my organization, as well as other organizations, wanted to limit gun ownership. But when the alt-right marches in front of a statue of Robert E. Lee with weapons over their shoulder and bandolier
It's protected under the Second Amendment.
exactly.
Yeah, they use it as a screen for everything. But the issue is a very, very difficult one, and it's one that it goes to again to a much deeper and broader problem that we have, and that's the influence of money on our democracy. And I really think that, I mean, we're talking about guns as just an issue of that, but that's really the major issue here. When you talk about usurping what the people of this country want, I mean, if you were to take a poll, for instance, let's use assault weapons as a perfect, okay, it's hard to eradicate all the guns that are in all the people's homes now. I mean, how many, 200 or 300 million guns in this country? You can't just go around and just grab everybody. It's going to be impossible to do. But how about putting a limit on assault weapons? Every one of these mass killings, and we happen to be doing this the day after there was a mass killing. Somebody walked into a church, a small church in a small peaceful community, and killed 26 people, half of whom were children, with an assault rifle. If he had, okay, he was crazy, and that's an issue. Mental health, but guns are an issue too. The first thing the president said was, "This is not a guns issue; it's a mental health." Well, it's both. And the assault rifle issue. If you poll the people in this country, I'm sure that 80% of the people would say there should be some kind of ban on purchasing an assault rifle for any purpose. It's certainly not needed for hunting.
It's not for sports.
It's meant to kill multiple. It's developed to kill multiple people as a weapon of war. There's no reason to have it, and yet, because the NRA has as much money as they have, and they can put it in the pockets of these legislators, it never ever comes up. The least little thing that we can do to put some kind of curb on these things always get knocked down, and it's always because of the lobbying effort. And that's something I think we have to look at very, very seriously.
You know, we had a lot of influence during my administration in Congress with the new capitalist and pouring money in to favor the railroads and the oil companies. However, the amount of money I see going into congressional campaigns, because there's no limits anymore, that is put in by my organization is astronomical, and both of your political parties, the Democrats today and the Republicans, are prisoners, and no one in either political party is willing to take a strong stand against ownership of assault weapons or weapons of mass destruction in terms of internal slaughter in the United States,
and
because they can't get elected if they take that position.
They take that position, and that is a good place for us to end this first episode in our series, the Second Amendment, and the NRA and the bastardization of the Second Amendment. This has been Conversations Across Time. My guest, President Ulysses Grant, and former defense counsel, not prosecutor, former defense counsel, Mr. Irv Madnick. Prosecutor is not a bad word. So anyway, please join us next week for the continuation of this conversation, the NRA and the bastardization of the Second Amendment.
Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time. Conversations